it's no fault of Elvis. He loved the song.
There was a day in 1973 when Dolly Parton sat down and wrote two of the greatest country songs ever recorded before the sun went down. Jolene. And I Will Always Love You. The same afternoon. The same pen. The same woman. And yet somehow, despite everything those songs proved about who she was, there were people in this industry, powerful people, celebrated people, people whose names fill concert halls and Grammy shelves, who looked at Dolly Parton and decided she was something to be managed, dismissed, exploited, or mocked. Who decided that the smile meant she wouldn't fight back? Who decided that the warmth meant she had no limits? They were wrong. Every single one of them. Because what most people have never understood about Dolly Parton is that the sweetness is real and the steel underneath it is equally real. She does not perform kindness as a strategy. She does not use grace as a weapon. But she remembers. Quietly, completely, and without ever needing to say so in public, she remembers everything. The broken promises. The stolen credit. The words said in interviews that found their way back to her. The doors slammed in her face by people who owed her far more than they ever admitted. And what you are about to find out is exactly who those people were. What they did. And what it cost them when Dolly finally had nothing left to prove. She was born on the 19th of January, 1946, in a one-room cabin in Locust Ridge, Tennessee. The fourth of 12 children in a family that had almost nothing by any material measure and everything by every other one. Her father could not read or write. Her mother had 12 children before she turned 35. They had no running water. No money for entertainment. No path forward that anyone standing outside that cabin would have looked at and called promising. But they had music. They sang in church and on the porch and wherever the day took them. And Dolly had something in her voice that nobody in Locust Ridge could quite explain. By the time she was 10, she was performing on local radio. By her early teens, she had played the Grand Ole Opry. The day after she graduated high school in 1964, she packed a single bag and left for Nashville with no connections, no money, and an absolute, unshakable certainty that she was going somewhere. She started as a songwriter, writing for other artists because that was the door that opened first. But she never intended to stay behind it. She had watched long enough. She wanted the light on her face, not just her name on someone else's record sleeve. And in 1967, everything shifted. Porter Wagoner was already a giant in country music when he brought Dolly onto his television show. He had the platform, the audience, and the authority. She was 21 years old and unknown outside of Nashville. What happened between them in the years that followed became one of the most complicated chapters in the history of country music, and one of the first times Dolly Parton discovered exactly what certain men in this industry believed they were entitled to. Because Porter did not simply give Dolly a platform. He gave her a platform and then quietly assumed that what was hers had become his. He managed her appearances. He decided what they recorded. He had final say over the shape of her career at every turn. And for years, Dolly played along, because she understood gratitude and she understood patience and she understood that the cage had a door she was going to walk through when she was ready. What she did not understand, not yet, was how hard Porter intended to make that walk. By 1974, she had outgrown the show in a way that was impossible to ignore. She was not Porter and Dolly anymore. She was Dolly. And she needed to leave. She told him so. She had told him before. She had been telling him for years, because she had promised him 5 years and had given him 7, and the weight of staying had become heavier than anything she wanted to carry. In the end, she left him the only way she knew how to. She wrote him a song. I Will Always Love You was not written about a romance. It was written about this. About leaving a man who had built something real with her and could not accept that she was leaving it. It was a farewell and an apology and a statement of independence wrapped inside 3 minutes of melody so pure that it eventually became one of the most covered songs in the history of recorded music. She handed it to Porter because she thought the song might say what she couldn't. He recorded it. And then, 5 years later, he sued her. The lawsuit was for $3 million. Management fees. Show expenses. A percentage of everything she had earned since walking away. Dolly did not drag him publicly. She did not call journalists and give her version. She settled quietly, out of court, because fighting was not what she wanted and freedom was. She later said he simply had a hard time letting go. That they were bound together in emotional ways that made rational endings impossible. She was generous in that description. More generous than most people would have been. What made it almost unbearable was the deeper truth underneath it. That Porter had seen her talent from the very beginning. Had believed in it enough to fight the fans who booed her when she first appeared. Had built something genuinely important alongside her. And then, when she had grown beyond what he had created, he had tried to own the growth itself. As if her becoming was something he was owed a percentage of. She inducted him into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2002. She visited him in hospital in 2007 when he was dying. She held a tribute concert at Dollywood after he was gone. She did all of this because that is who Dolly Parton is. But she has also never pretended it didn't happen. The wound was real. The lawsuit was real. And the lesson it taught her about what certain men in this industry believed they were entitled to stayed with her for the rest of her career. It prepared her for what came next. In the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley wanted I Will Always Love You. Let that sit for a moment. The king of rock and roll, at the absolute height of his cultural power, heard that song and decided he had to have it. His team reached out. The machinery began moving. And Dolly, who was still building her name and her catalog and her place in the industry, was asked to hand over something she had written in a single afternoon in 1973. The problem was not Elvis. She has said clearly, in interview after interview, that she loved him as an artist and was genuinely moved that he wanted the song. The problem was Colonel Tom Parker, his manager. A man whose entire operating philosophy was built around the idea that proximity to Elvis entitled him to a piece of everything Elvis touched. Parker demanded 50% of the publishing rights, half of the most important copyright in Dolly's entire catalog, in exchange for the honor of having Elvis record it. She said no. She said it politely and she said it clearly and she said it with full awareness of what she was risking. This is the most important copyright in my whole publishing company, she told his team. I cannot do that. Elvis was reportedly devastated. He had loved the song. He had wanted it. And Dolly has admitted that the situation created a tension between them that never fully resolved, that Elvis was sensitive about the refusal in a way that shifted something between them. She felt the loss of that. She respected him enormously and she did not want to cause him pain. But she knew something that Colonel Parker had not accounted for. She knew exactly what that song was worth. Not just financially, not just commercially, but in terms of what it represented about her right to her own work. Porter Wagoner had already tried to own a piece of her becoming. She was not going to let it happen again. Not for Elvis. Not for anyone. 19 years later, Whitney Houston recorded I Will Always Love You for The Bodyguard. It became one of the best-selling singles in the history of popular music. It made Dolly millions of dollars in royalties. Every single cent of it belonged entirely to her. She has said she went home after turning down Colonel Parker and cried. She was heartbroken at losing the chance, at the tension it created, at the weight of saying no to someone she genuinely admired. And then she has said she got down on her knees and thanked God she did it. The next person who underestimated her did it in a recording studio in broad daylight with witnesses. The trio album, Dolly, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris, is one of the most celebrated collaborations in country music history. Three voices that had no business sounding as perfect together as they did. Platinum sales. Grammy wins. Songs that still stop a room when they come on. From the outside, it looked like harmony in every possible sense of the word. From the inside, it was considerably more complicated. Dolly and Linda Ronstadt had fundamentally different relationships with the recording process. Dolly worked fast. She always had. She could walk into a studio, feel the song, and nail it in 1 or 2 takes because she had already lived with it long enough to know exactly what she wanted to say. Linda was a perfectionist of an entirely different order. Hours on a single vocal. Layers of consideration over every phrase. Sessions that stretched far beyond anything Dolly's schedule could comfortably absorb. The tension between their working styles was real and it accumulated across the years the project took to complete. But what made it publicly raw was what Linda said afterward. She gave interviews in which she described Dolly as unreliable. As someone who would cancel plans, show up late, and fail to give the collaboration the commitment it deserved. She said Dolly was always a little flaky. That she seemed more focused on her solo career than on the group effort. That the lack of professionalism had soured what was meant to be a joyful project. Linda said it clearly and without obvious regret. And those words found their way back to Dolly. Dolly has always been proud of her work ethic in ways that go far deeper than public image. She grew up in a family where work was survival. Where showing up was not optional. Where the idea of being called unreliable would have felt like an accusation about her character, not just her scheduling. For Linda to say it publicly, to put it on record, cut in a way that simple creative disagreement never could. The second album, Trio 2, sat unreleased from 1994 until 1999 because of label disputes and complications that had as much to do with the atmosphere between them as anything institutional. The music was there. Getting it across the finish line was another matter entirely. They have not been warm since. There is no dramatic public falling out on record. No confrontation caught on camera. But there is an absence. An absence of the kind of warmth that three women who made something genuinely great together should probably feel when their names appear in the same sentence. Dolly has been careful about what she has said publicly. She always is. But she has never pretended the trio experience was uncomplicated, and she has never suggested she would rush to repeat it. Then came the moment that crossed every line Dolly Parton has ever drawn around herself. In 2008, Howard Stern's production team took recordings from Dolly's own audiobook, her actual voice, her actual words, captured for a project she had made with complete sincerity, and spliced them together into a fabricated interview. The resulting segment made it sound as though Dolly had made racist remarks, had insulted colleagues including Kenny Rogers and Linda Ronstadt by name, and had said things about her own body and her own life that were crude beyond description. They played it on air. They laughed. Dolly issued a public statement that those who follow her career recognized immediately as something entirely outside her normal register. She said she had never been so shocked, hurt, and humiliated in her entire life. She said she could not believe what had been done to her. She said that if there was ever going to be a lawsuit, this was it. Dolly Parton threatening legal action is not a sentence that appears in the historical record very often. It tells you everything about where she was in that moment. Stern did not apologize. He called it satire. He said people were being too sensitive. He laughed it off with the particular brand of confidence that comes from never having had to genuinely reckon with what your words do to another person. For 15 years, their paths did not cross. And then, in 2023, Dolly walked into his studio to promote her rock album Rockstar. She sat across from the man who had taken her voice and turned it into something unrecognizable, and she was professional and she was warm and she was completely in control of every second of the encounter. Stern called her a legend. He was respectful in a way that felt slightly careful, as though he understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was in the presence of someone who had absorbed what he did and come out the other side of it without losing a single piece of herself. Dolly proved something in that studio that she has been proving her entire career. That her grace is not the absence of memory. It is the presence of something stronger than the need for public revenge. And then there is Jeff Tweedy of Wilco, who gave an interview in which he said that Dolly wrote Jolene and I Will Always Love You on the same day and that he thought she should have stopped after Jolene. He called her lyrics superficial. He suggested her success was more about her persona than the depth of her songwriting. He was careful not to be outright cruel, but the dismissal was complete and he offered it without apparent hesitation. This is the particular kind of wound that cuts cleanest. Not the lawsuit or the fabricated audio or the accusations of flakiness, but the quiet intellectual condescension of a fellow musician deciding that what you spent your life building does not quite qualify as serious art. Dolly wrote I Will Always Love You from inside a real ending with a real person who had real power over her life. She wrote Jolene from a real fear about a real woman whose name she borrowed from a little girl she met at a concert. She has written songs about poverty and faith and grief and the particular loneliness of being a woman in rooms full of men who have already decided what you are. To have that body of work described as superficial by someone whose own catalog reaches a fraction of the people hers has touched is not a critique. It is a misunderstanding wearing the clothes of one. She has never responded to Tweedy directly. She did not need to. Her songs have been covered by artists across every genre imaginable. They have outlasted every trend and every opinion and every interview given by every musician who ever decided that popularity and depth were mutually exclusive. What connects every person on this list is not malice, though some of what was done to Dolly Parton deserves that word without apology. What connects them is the shared assumption that she would absorb it. That the smile was an invitation to take. That the warmth was a kind of permission. That a woman who had come from nothing and built everything with her own hands and her own voice and her own relentless refusal to quit would simply accept whatever was handed to her and move forward without keeping score. Every single one of them misjudged what they were dealing with. Because behind that dazzling exterior, behind the laugh and the self-deprecating wit and the extraordinary generosity she has shown to millions of people in ways that have nothing to do with cameras or publicity, there is a woman who sat in a one-room cabin in Tennessee at 10 years old and decided that she was going somewhere. Who turned down the king of rock and roll to protect something she had made with her own hands. Who walked out of a $1 million lawsuit and wrote her way back to the top. Who sat across from the man who humiliated her on national radio and conducted herself with more dignity than he had managed in 30 years of broadcasting. Dolly Parton has never needed to name her enemies loudly. She just needed to outlast them. And she has. Every single time.